Sela System, Orbit of Sela, mid-2670. War Chief General Torlak. Sitting above the rows of displays and computers sat the Chief General Torlak. Beside him was Orlin, the former commander of the superstation in geosynchronous orbit of their capital city, Artre. Orlin commanded and organized the offense, while Torlak dealt with the defenses. They had a plethora of ships to defend against attack, and he wished he could supplement his forces from the border worlds. He knew if he did that, it would leave their borders wide open for an attack by the Union. As far as he was aware, the border fleets knew little of the conflict that arose in the heart of their empire, save for what speeches were sent to them via the official network. But that would have to be an item for later discussion. It didn't take long for their enemy to appear in orbit after wiping out his old fleet that he had sent to intercept them. They were able to interpolate the data provided to them by the icons identifying friend and foe. The command center watched the battle unfold, utilizing the live feeds provided to them from their late comrades. And instead of mourning for them, Torlak and Orlin took this chance to strategize a counter, with Orlin the first to speak. "We have no doubt made the enemy expend their weapons store drastically," he stated, noting how long the battle lasted and utilizing a calculation to estimate shots fired from the enemy. "If we strike while they rest, I'm sure we can destroy them." It was a sound strategy for Torlak, and he considered it, but ultimately denied a secondary offensive. "We can't afford to divert any more ships from orbit. To do so could spell disaster for us. Recall all available fighters from the surface to aid in orbit defenses." "As you command, Chief General," replied Orlin. To others, the call to retask planetary fighters was an odd one, but many sided with Torlak on his decision. As their enemy is only known to be coming from space, it made sense to redirect fighters to orbit rather than wait on the surface. This boosted their totals for fighters, and that was the end of that. "Prepare a quick response fleet, Orlin, for when the enemy enters Sela's influence," ordered Torlak. The purpose for the quick response fleet was simple: be the first fleet to engage the enemy and relay all information relating to the enemy so that command can better adjust for aberrations in the enemy's strategy. He had analyzed what little he could from their encounters, but one thing remained true. "Orlin, relay to all capital ships that engage with the enemy this: keep your ship moving and keep out of range of their bow and broadsides," mentioned the Chief General. "How should they approach then?" questioned Orlin as he prepared his message. "My suggestion is to maintain a heading at 45 degrees from the bow," Torlak began. "The enemy employs a devastating weapon that runs the spine of their larger ships. It's fixed, so the ship must maneuver to land a shot." His explanation began to gather a crowd of the fledgling chiefs who worked aboard the station. Many of their frigate-class ships field a large array of cannons on their broadside. By using this heading, we can minimize damage to acceptable levels for ship shielding. The crowd before him were awed by his tactical analysis and stratagem against an unknown enemy. "What are they like?" spoke one chief, his promotion scarf still fresh from its package. The question also garnered support from like-minded individuals, as many have never been in combat with the enemy. Torlak looked at Orlin, who only shrugged, prompting him to answer. "They are a fierce race, ruthless, calculating, and what we've seen so far, efficient." He took a moment to gauge his audience before continuing. "Their weapons are primitive in concept, but it is a medium that they have perfected. I have seen rounds from their ballistic cannons melt a ship's hull. That's right, melt. Not torn to shreds by high explosives, but turned to molten slag with a fire that persisted even in the void." Torlak grew passionate, yet ultimately fearful of the Terran use of munitions. If anything, they revolutionized his view of ship weaponry. If they weren't in their current predicament, then perhaps his military could have developed weapons as effective as the Terrans. If it's one thing I respect of them, is their weapons technology, which is why you don't underestimate your opponent. They agreed with a collective shout of affirmation, then returned to their stations when they found their curiosity satisfied. Orlin, on the other hand, creeped beside Torlak, who began to work on a defense plan, and spoke to him softly to keep curious eyes from listening in. Are the Terrans really as bad as Polis made them out to be? What exactly did they do? The question caught him off guard, but he matched his friend's tone and delivered his explanation in a low whisper. I do not know, nor do I care, he replied, his words stinging like a whip. Just know what you ask is in defiance of the Council, perhaps even the spirit of the Fathers. Orlin recoiled back to the sudden shift in demeanor of his fellow war chief. I only ask to better know of our enemy. It would be best if you drop it, old friend, Torlak replied. Nothing good will come of this exchange. I did what I thought was best for our empire, and it was the Council who deemed these beings as subject for extermination. I am ashamed of my defeat, and for that, they knock on our doorstep. Torlak no longer minded his tone and spoke his mind. Orlin responded calmly, maintaining a saintly disposition. Very well, Tor. What's done is done. It appears they come to destroy our home, and I can't let that happen. I will ensure that I operate as a chief commander should and fend them off. Perhaps after, we can reconcile. Before Orlin could finish, alarms blared from a chief on the lower level of where Torlak sat, and directed his attention to the large monitor at the front of the command center. The indicators of the enemy that were sighted in the Tila belt were gone, and the cluster of red indicators formed towards the west, in the space above the plains west of the city. Now was not the time for him to rest, and as ordered, gave the order to sortie fighters to aid with the response fleet. From the displays, he saw the enemy ships form in a way that the groups of Terran ships created a cubed formation, with their ships at the vertices of the imaginary cube. The distance was several hundred kilometers between each group, but allowed for them to send available troops from the nearest cluster. It was an odd formation, and one he had never seen before in all his time as a fleet commander. Chief General, called a crew member, the response fleet had engaged perimeter forces and are standing by for orders and report enemy ships firing with broadsides. He expected the enemy to take out their ships with the spinal cannon, as was their usual tactic, but that was not the case here. And with a flare on the sensors, a small group of fighter-sized ships departed from the center group. Crew analysts generated a predicted path which revealed his greatest fear. General, enemy transports are expected to land planet-side, west of the city. Direct fighters from the front to engage those ships. Don't let them touch down on the planet, he ordered with fervor. A flurry of fighters detached from the response fleet, as ordered, and flew towards their primary objective. A trail of exhaust exited the main vector nozzles, giving the ships an afterglow effect as they flew to their targets. When they're in range, they are ordered to engage the enemy. Full weapon dispense is authorized. Leave none standing, he ordered, with his command relayed as quickly as it was spoken. Torlak watched on the grand display as the strike force of fighters closed on the enemy, most likely maxing out their thrust output at the cost of shields. He was once a pilot for fighters in his earlier days, and as he remembered, a fighter had to be able to juggle between three key systems: engines, shields, and weapons. Power cores for ships at the time were only capable of generating enough power to evenly grant the previously mentioned systems the minimum required power. So in a dogfight, shields and weapons were chosen over engines, while evasion favored shields and engines. This game was key with Union pilots, but his empire was barely a cut above most of their fighter pilots, a feat he prided himself in. Smaller indicators began flashing, and a call from a chief on the lower row of monitors reported that the fighters had made contact with the enemy, but this time, more indicators flashed, revealing an enemy approaching from their left flank. Chief General, interceptors began firing against the transports but were intercepted by medium-class fighters, reported the chief. How many did they send? We hold the advantage, 3-2, they reported. Torlak grumbled at the odds. From what the analysts had told him, a single Terran medium fighter could fend off 2, if not 3, small-class fighters on its own. It outmatched them with armor and firepower, but for his ships, they had speed. Order the fighters to evade. They're faster than the medium class, and have them focus fire on vulnerable enemy ships." The chief nodded at his order and relayed them to the fighters currently en route. Not long after, another set of indicators rang, signaling that the fighters had engaged the enemy. In front of him, a moderately sized table was stationed, and with a press of a button lit up to life and a close-up of the battle generated before him. It was a focused generation of the battle, but given a three-dimensional space. Using his fingers, he moved the battlefield to any orientation that suited him as he analyzed friend and foe alike. Aside from the glass surface, there was no real indication of depth beyond the holographic indicators that danced around each, save for a virtual graph that he manually input, giving the field of battle some form of depth. The main display at the front of the command center remained the same, showing all locations of known enemy and friendly units. There were 2 other stations besides his own, but most of their ships were redirected over their capital, because should the enemy take over their space, then they could still defend the most vital city on the planet, the home of their council. "How are city defenses faring? Do we have enough ground troops to cover for the cannons?" asked Torlak, his questions answered by the most knowledgeable chief on the subject. "We have a series of missile batteries along the walls, but to conserve power, we have them running at minimum until aerial sensors are tripped. As for ground troops, we have the inner city on patrol, and most of the residents have been evacuated." He was pleased with their explanation, but figured that troops should be on their way to the planet now, if they don't turn them into space debris. But when he thought they had, the edge was now quickly overturned with a new encounter. As he saw, several Celian fighters attempted to fire against the transports, but were fended off by a greater force of Terran ships that fought desperately to defend the fighters. Their defense was enough to buy them enough time for a fresh batch of fighters to enter the fray. It was reported that they were small-class fighters, and their speed alone outmatched his just enough to sow discord and chaos among them. With many of his own fighters out of commission, and half of the original enemy intercept force also neutralized, the entry of more enemy fighters were enough to declare an early victory to the Terrans. He recoiled at the sight when his fighters dwindled one by one until none were left. With sensors detecting that all transports were still intact, he was ready to issue another wave of fighters immediately descend to the planet to engage them. Alarms rang, causing him to pause his decision. It was in the opposite sector, a complete 180 degrees from the current field of battle. Reports from numerous war chiefs had begun flooding into his command center with calls to aid of the sudden arrival of enemy ships. He was curious at their sudden appearance, since no notification was given of them entering or exiting sublight travel. Another mystery to Terran technology that he sought to uncover. He issued for a call from a chief commander be put through to give an immediate and prompt report. "Chief General," the commander spoke. "Commander Ballon, what of the enemy?" he replied. "I do not know, but the enemy appeared from nowhere. We kept a sensitive hand on the scanners, but their approach was too sudden. It was as if an IS gate appeared before us, then next thing we knew, the enemy appeared and began firing into our ships. All in, reroute fighters to support their sector. We must counter with an offensive. The time to drive off the enemy is now." He scanned the monitors nearest to him, as well as the ever-updating central display at the front of the room. A cluster of enemy ships were intermixed with his own, no doubt raining their hellfire against them, when he noticed the icons mixed with the enemy as familiar. They were icons given to all Celian vessels when registered for the first time, and it was something hard-coded into the ship should any Celian turn against their own. "Yorla," he growled, "get me a line with the traitor." A display to the left of the main display turned from black to a female Celian of light blue hair with black highlights tied into a high knot. Her skin was a fair pastel pink with a darker shade of markings. "Heavy Cruiser Sword of Celia, Chief Commander Yorla," he addressed her as she peered into his command center. "What is a traitor, like yourself, filing with the likes of the Terrans?" "I have seen what our own have done to the Terrans," she replied. "I thought we fought a war over this with the Union. Look at how far you've fallen, Torlak." Her tone as she spoke his grade stung through the air, causing many around him to look at his reaction, but did well to hide his discomfort. He had noticed on her person a change in headdress from her usual commander's attire. It was more ornate than one's authorized for ship use, which garnered curiosity amidst his growing anger. "I have noticed a change in headdress. Even for someone in your position, I would hope to think that you would at least keep to ship customs. Surely you haven't forgotten where we've come from." She placed her hand on the headdress that he was referencing. She gave a small smile, causing many around Torlak, himself included, to wonder why she would cast away even the most basic of ship customs. "You see, Torlak, I have gone against Terran might. I have seen what they can do firsthand when brought with no other choice than to retaliate. They have shown me the truth of what many of our brethren are complicit in. Instead of firing upon us when they could, I was instead presented with a chance to live." Her face was shown reminiscing of the event, even amidst the chaos that rang beyond their hulls, but she continued, her story gripping many within the command center. She continued, "And yes, it is true. I have aided the Terrans in their campaign against the Council." The mention of the Council irked him, as the mention was nothing but pure treason. "I'm sure you noticed." She motioned to her headdress once more. "But I am engaged, and to the very people you made war against, a Terran. The man I am betrothed to also leads this attack in your eastern sector. Know this." Her conviction was evident in her stern yet commanding voice. "I will aid the Terrans, and the Council will fall." The call was cut, leaving Torlak and all those present in silence, with only the hum of electronics filling the air. Torlak was the first to break the heavy silence with an order of execution. "Chief Commander Yorla shall pay for her crimes, as will all who follow her. Orlin," he turned to the stoic commander, "I want a force to take her down and turn to dust." He then turned to the rest of the command center that had remained silent to the exchange with both the general and the traitor commander. "Know this. The Terrans have played tricks to force a once loyal warrior of Celia and the War Council, and turned her away from the very people she swore to protect. I will not let the poison of Terran lies fill her head any longer, nor should you all. They are a plague, and it is our duty to drive them from our home." The regular clamor before the hail had returned, and the usual command vigor resurfaced. His persuasion had worked, and he could see that the young chiefs were working harder than they were before. For a moment, he felt what it was like to be Councilman Polis, thinking to himself that he might even take his office after this is over. But for now, he waited for Orlin's task force to take care of Yorla, as well as reorganizing the sector of the new enemy fleet. He hadn't felt much emotion before, but his interaction with Yorla had created a feeling of discontent he didn't think he had in himself. He would use that to fuel his growing hate of the Terrans. "Now isn't the time to wait. Organize with the other stations to supplement our forces. Crush the enemy from both sides," ordered the general. "But that would leave the other stations defenseless," spoke a nearby chief. "They have cover from the surface cannons. Right now, we need to overwhelm our enemy. I doubt they have the stores to fight much longer. Don't forget to send some fighters for those ships that entered the planet." The chief consigned to his reasoning and made the request. The effect was almost immediate, as numerous ships from the other two stations began their journey to their aid. They still had some time before they could make contact, but by then, it would spell defeat for the Terran menace. A victory he ached for, as did many loyal to Sela. "Soon," he began, directing his voice to those working about in the command center, "we shall reign victorious over the Terrans, and we will strike at their home.